The federal warrant named Zaire Whitcomb 3 hours before the reunion began. Knox County Ballroom. Kala at the microphone. A cream envelope in her hand that had appeared under his door with no return address. The wristband from his janitor shift still stuck to his sleeve. But what came next destroyed everything he thought he knew about why he was there. The badge access logs the investigators pulled. They showed Zaire approving $12 million in shipments to vendors that didn't exist, while he was at his daughter's parent-teacher conference in Prince George's County. The reunion wasn't about humiliation. It was a signal flare. Someone inside the institution had been staging evidence for months, using his credentials to build a fraud case across Cook County, Harris County, and the DMV corridor, and they needed visual confirmation he was still alive before the warrants dropped. Drop a comment where you're watching from and subscribe before someone with access decides you know too much. The leak that targeted Zaire? Still inside. Still feeding them updates. And the hearing that cleared him didn't catch who's pulling the strings. The federal warrant listed Zaire Whitcomb as the primary suspect 3 hours before anyone at the reunion knew his name was in the system. "You're here to mop up the mess you made," Kala Hartwell said into the microphone, and the way her voice carried across the ballroom made it sound less like a joke and more like a verdict. Zaire still had the event wristband stuck to his sleeve where it wouldn't stay, still had the faint smell of bleach clinging to his hands because he'd come straight from a late shift in Arlington. And now 200 alumni in pressed blazers and cocktail dresses turned in their seats like a single animal, eyes narrowing, hungry for a clean story with a dirty man at the center. The Westmoreland University crest hung behind the podium in gold thread, the kind that always looks expensive under warm-up lighting. And Zaire could feel his daughter's words from the car ride up I-40 repeating like a dare, "Just go, Dad. Let them see you're still standing." He had barely made it past the check-in table in Knoxville, Knox County, before Kala found him. She didn't ask how he'd been. She didn't ask about 8 years of silence and court dates and the kind of exhaustion that makes a person forget the last time they laughed. She pointed at his name tag, read Zaire Whitcomb, out loud like it tasted wrong, and then told the room what she wanted them to believe. That he'd been let go for stealing. That he'd fallen so far he was now the janitor who cleans up after successful people. The first laugh came from the back, the kind that always starts as relief. "Thank God it's not me," before it becomes cruelty. And then Kala leaned closer to the mic, eyes bright, and dropped the accusation that made Zaire's stomach go cold because it wasn't even about the past anymore. "Ask him why he's been lying about where he works," she said, letting the question hang in the air like smoke. "Ask him why he won't say who his boss is." The room shifted, phone cameras rising like a reflex, because moments like these were why people came to reunions, not for nostalgia, but for confirmation that someone else's life had collapsed harder. Zaire opened his mouth, but the room was already moving faster than truth. Someone near the bar muttered, "Man, that's sad." Like pity was a virtue. A former fraternity buddy, now thick around the middle and confident in a way only people with stable paychecks can be, called out, "You still doing night shifts, Z?" And the laughter rolled again. Zaire's jaw tightened because if he answered, it would sound like defending himself, and if he stayed quiet, it would look like guilt. He could feel the old instinct rising, the one that told him to keep his head down, keep it simple, keep moving, survive it, and go home. Until Kala lifted a cream envelope above her head like a trophy. "I almost forgot," she said, and her smile didn't touch her eyes. "He came with paperwork." The room leaned in. Zaire recognized the envelope because it had been slipped under his apartment door the week before. No return address. Only his name written in neat, deliberate block letters. He brought it because he needed to know who was reaching into his life again. Kala waved it once, slow, so everyone could see. "He wants to tell you he's just a janitor," she said. "But janitors don't get envelopes like this." She tapped the seal with one fingernail. Near the side exit, a man in a gray suit checked his phone the moment Kala said Zaire's full name. Not filming, just texting, fingers moving with the kind of quiet urgency that didn't belong in a room full of people pretending to have fun. He pocketed the device and slipped through the door before anyone else in the room noticed. Kala didn't see him leave. She was already moving to open the envelope, her fingers sliding under the flap, when a hand closed around her wrist with the gentle certainty of someone who didn't need to squeeze to be obeyed. The contact was so out of place, so wrong inside that glittering ballroom, that it startled the room into silence. The man who stepped between Kala and the podium wore a plain navy suit that didn't look expensive until you saw how it fit him, how it moved with him like a uniform. His hair was cut close, not trendy, just functional. His face held the kind of hard quiet that doesn't belong to people who argue for a living. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't smile. He only looked at Kala the way you look at a locked door you already have the key to. "That envelope isn't yours," he said, and the mic picked it up perfectly. Then he turned, and his eyes landed on Zaire with a recognition that was too personal to be explained away as coincidence. "Whitcomb," he said softly, like a name you say when you're checking a pulse. "You okay?" The room blinked. Kala's mouth parted as if she'd suddenly realized the story she'd prepared no longer belonged to her. Someone whispered, "Who is that?" And another voice answered, uncertain, "Security." The man reached into his inner jacket pocket and didn't pull out a weapon or a badge like everyone expected. He pulled out a single coin and flipped it once, catching it without looking. It made a small, dull sound in his palm, and then he set it on the podium where the university crest glowed behind it. On one side was a trident, on the other a set of initials worn smooth from years of handling. Zaire felt the floor tilt, not from fear, but from the sudden weight of a past he'd tried to bury for his daughter's sake. He knew that coin. He knew what it meant. And he knew the man holding the room still without trying. Kala recovered first, because people like her always do. "This is a reunion," she said, forcing a laugh, trying to make him smaller by making it casual. "We're having fun." She gestured toward Zaire's sleeve as if the wristband and the faint chemical smell were proof of anything. "He's staff." The man didn't even glance at Zaire's clothes. "He's not staff," he said, and the calm in his voice made the words heavier than shouting. "He's my employee, and you don't get to touch his mail." That should have been enough, but the room needed a label before it could adjust its moral balance. "Who are you?" Kala asked, sharpening the question like a blade. "His boss?" "From where?" "Some cleaning company." The man finally looked at her, and there was something almost weary in it, like he'd seen this kind of performance before in places where the stakes were higher than reputation. "Graham Sutter," he said into the microphone, and a few heads turned immediately because the name rang in the wrong places, in DC circles, in contractor circles, in news segments people half-watch in hotel gyms. "And I'm here because you were about to make a very public mistake." He slid the envelope out of Kala's hand without a struggle and didn't open it. He held it for a second like he was weighing something unseen. His eyes moved across the ballroom, pausing not on the crowd but on the exit Kala had entered through, as if calculating something no one else was thinking about. When Kala heard the name, something shifted in her face, not confusion, not anger, but something much colder. Fear. The kind that comes from recognizing a name you weren't supposed to hear in a place like this. "This isn't a love letter," Graham said, turning back to the microphone with the envelope still in his hand. "It's a summons." The word hit the room like a dropped glass. Kala's smile collapsed. Zaire felt his pulse kick, because he'd assumed the envelope was another custody threat, another way Kala liked to press her thumb into his life. A summons meant something else, something bigger, and the way Graham said it, flat, controlled, made it clear the envelope was only the surface of what was happening here. Graham didn't wait for the room to process what had happened. He placed one hand on Zaire's shoulder, not rough, just firm enough to communicate direction, and nodded toward the side exit where the ballroom's warm light gave way to the hotel's fluorescent corridor. Zaire followed because the alternative was staying in a room where 200 people were already rewriting the story in real time, deciding whether he was a victim or a fraud, whether Graham was a hero or just another complication. The murmur behind them swelled as they moved, not loud enough to be called outrage, but dense enough to feel like pressure pressing against his back. Kala's voice rose above it, trying to reclaim control with a joke that landed flat, and someone near the bar said, "That was weird," which was the closest thing to mercy anyone in that room would offer. The corridor smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and faint citrus, and the silence between them stretched long enough that Zaire felt the need to fill it. "You didn't have to do that," he said, immediately regretting it because it sounded like gratitude when what he felt was confusion. Graham didn't slow down. "Yeah, I did," he said, and his tone made it clear this wasn't about chivalry. He scanned the hallway for exits and cameras. They reached the service elevator, and Graham hit the button twice, fast, like he'd already calculated how long they had before someone followed. Zaire's phone buzzed in his pocket twice. He pulled it out and saw 3 missed calls from a number he didn't recognize, the area code tied to Arlington or Fairfax, somewhere in Northern Virginia where his nights blurred into cleaning schedules. No voicemail, just the calls, stacked one after the other like a countdown. He showed Graham the screen, and Graham's jaw tightened in a way that confirmed the calls weren't coincidence. "Don't answer yet," Graham said as the elevator doors opened. They stepped inside, and the doors were halfway closed when Kala's voice cut through. "Wait." She wasn't running, but she was moving faster than dignity usually allowed, her heels clicking on the tile in a rhythm that sounded like panic dressed up as purpose. Graham didn't hold the door. He let it close another 6 inches before pressing the button to stop it. And when Kala stepped into the gap, her face was different than it had been on stage. The performance was gone. What was left looked smaller, more human, and maybe more dangerous because of it. "I didn't know," she said, and her hands were shaking in a way Zaire had never seen before, not when she'd filed for divorce, not when she'd argued for full custody. "I didn't know it was a summons." Graham studied her the way you study a document you're not sure is authentic. "Who told you to be there tonight?" he asked, and the question was so direct it left no room for anything except the truth or a very good lie. Kala's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Zaire like she wanted him to intervene, but Zaire had spent 8 years learning not to rescue her from consequences. "Someone called," she said finally. "They said you were stealing. They said if I helped confirm where you'd be, it would help me in court." The elevator chimed, and Graham stepped out into the parking garage where the air was cooler and overhead lights buzzed. Zaire followed. Kala stayed in the elevator, her hand holding the door. Graham walked toward a vehicle near the exit ramp, but his eyes caught on a sedan idling 2 rows over, engine running, no one inside. He shifted their path toward the stairwell. Zaire's chest felt tight from the realization that nothing tonight had been random. Not the reunion, not the envelope, not Kala's cruelty. Graham glanced back, saw Zaire processing it, and said the thing that made all the earlier details rearrange into a pattern Zaire didn't want to see. "You never were just maintenance. Subscribe before you assume you know who the invisible people around you really are." Here's what the room in Knoxville didn't know, and what Zaire had tried not to know until the last second. Zaire hadn't taken the janitor job because his life fell apart. He took it because staying visible in the wrong way gets people erased quietly. After the divorce, after the weekends he slept in his car because he couldn't afford both rent and a lawyer, Zaire did what a lot of men do when the world decides their story. He shrank. He worked nights in Arlington, learned which gas stations in Fairfax County were safest at 2 in the morning, learned which teachers in his daughter's school in Prince George's County would look him in the eye like a parent. And when he took the facility job at a defense-adjacent campus in Arlington, where floors never squeaked and hallways always smelled like cold air and money, he told himself it was just stable work. What he didn't say out loud was why the job offer came with a private meeting at a diner in Norfolk, Virginia, why the man across from him had placed a sealed coin on the table first, why the paperwork was clean and the background check fast. Graham Sutter hadn't hired him because he needed a janitor. Graham hired him because he needed someone who could disappear in plain sight inside a building full of people who assumed janitors were invisible. Graham wasn't a boss in the corporate sense. Zaire had worked under him years earlier in places people don't put on resumes. Coronado in San Diego County for training, Mayport in Duval County, Florida, then a deployment that began in Pierce County, Washington, and ended in a dust-colored town Zaire still couldn't say without tasting grit. Zaire had left the teams for his daughter, for custody, for the promise that being a good father meant never letting that life touch her. Graham had found him anyway, not to drag him back, but to shield him. The building in Arlington wasn't just another cleaning contract. It was offices where procurement officers moved contracts worth millions, where shipping manifests passed through Prince William County before items arrived, where encrypted drives sat in charging bays like office supplies. Zaire's reality had been simple on the surface. cleaning spaces where powerful people assumed invisibility. But wrong shipments started showing up, items that didn't match purchase orders, deliveries routed through Manassas and Woodbridge that never appeared in inventory logs. Zaire had seen shipping labels that didn't match vendor codes he'd memorized from months of emptying trash near procurement desks. He'd seen after-hours deliveries signed off with badge numbers that belonged to people who weren't supposed to be in the building past 6. And then he'd found the storage device, a small encrypted flash drive dropped behind a server rack like trash. He'd reported it quietly because that's what men like him do when they believe systems can work. The report disappeared. Then the envelope appeared under his door with no return address, just his name in block letters. That's when Zaire understood the second-story layer. The one he didn't want to believe until Graham said it out loud in the stairwell of a Knoxville hotel. Cala's reunion ambush wasn't really about humiliation. It was about exposure. The envelope hadn't come from Cala at all. It came from someone who wanted Zaire standing under a chandelier in a crowded room, with his name spoken into a microphone, with his face recorded by a dozen phones, not for social media justice, not for viral embarrassment, but for something colder and more practical and more dangerous, to confirm he was still alive and still within reach. Graham leaned against the concrete wall of the stairwell, fluorescent light casting shadows under his eyes that made him look older than he had in the ballroom. "The building's about to be searched," he said. "Federal warrants. Multi-county procurement fraud spanning Cook County in Illinois, Harris County in Texas, and half the DMV corridor. They need someone to blame before the paperwork goes public." Zaire felt his throat tighten. "I'm not a thief." Graham's expression didn't change. "I know. But you're the inconvenient witness who saw too much. And someone inside wants you labeled before the warrants hit." The reunion had been loud, but the real war was quiet. It started with a phone call Zaire didn't receive until he was already back on the road, Graham driving a rental sedan south on I-81 with the kind of deliberate focus that made conversation feel like a distraction. Zaire's phone buzzed again, and this time he answered because the number belonged to his daughter's school in Prince George's County, Maryland, and schools don't call at 11 at night unless something is wrong. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, the kind of tone people use when they're reading from a script they didn't write. "Mr. Whitcomb, we're calling to confirm whether the individual who came to pick up your daughter this afternoon was authorized." Zaire's hand tightened on the phone. "What individual?" The pause on the other end lasted 2 seconds too long. A Mr. Larkin presented himself at the front office around 2:30 with documentation stating he had your permission to pick up your daughter early for a medical appointment. We followed protocol and asked for identification, which he provided, but when we cross-referenced the name with our authorized pickup list, it wasn't there. We didn't release your daughter, but we wanted to confirm whether you had submitted a recent change we might have missed. Zaire felt the car slow as Graham glanced at him, reading his face the way people do when they've seen panic before it fully arrives. "I didn't send anyone," Zaire said. "I don't know anyone named Larkin." The administrator's voice shifted, losing its professional distance. "We have the documentation on file if you'd like to see it." He left a business card as well. "We thought it was unusual, but everything appeared legitimate until we checked the list." Zaire's throat felt dry. "Is she safe? Is she still there?" The answer came quickly, like it had been rehearsed. "She's home with her grandmother. We called the emergency contact after the incident. Your daughter is fine, Mr. Whitcomb, but we thought you should know." Graham pulled the car into a gas station off the highway in Fairfax County, Virginia, the kind of place that's always open and always empty, fluorescent lights buzzing over cracked asphalt. He parked under a light that flickered like it was deciding whether to stay on. Zaire ended the call and sat there, phone still in his hand, trying to process what he'd just heard. Graham didn't ask what happened. He waited, which was worse, because it meant he already knew the shape of it. "Someone tried to pick up my daughter," Zaire said finally. "Used a name I've never heard. Had documentation." Graham's jaw tightened. "They're moving faster than I thought." Zaire looked at him. "Who's that?" Graham didn't answer right away. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, then showed Zaire the screen. It was a text from a number with no name. "They know you moved him. Adjust timeline." The message had come in 40 minutes earlier. "Someone inside is feeding them updates," Graham said. "They knew you left Knoxville. They knew where your daughter goes to school. They're testing access points." Zaire's phone buzzed again, And this time it was a text from Kala. I heard what happened at the school. We need to talk. The fact that she knew before Zaire had even processed it, made his stomach turn. He showed Graham the message. Graham's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped. Don't answer yet. He stepped out of the car, phone pressed to his ear, pacing under the flickering light. Zaire watched him through the windshield, watched the way his shoulders tensed, the way he turned his back to the road. When Graham came back, his face looked harder. They accelerated, he said. We need to get to the school now. The drive to Prince George's County took 30 minutes, and every one of them felt like waiting for something to break. When they pulled into the school parking lot, the building was dark except for the front office. And standing in the lobby, visible through the glass doors, was a man in a gray jacket holding a clipboard with a name written in block letters. Whitcomb. The man in the lobby didn't wait for Zaire to reach the door. He saw them through the glass, saw Graham's posture and the way Zaire moved like someone who'd been expecting trouble, and made a decision that looked like discretion but felt like retreat. He turned, tucked the clipboard under his arm, and walked toward the side hallway that led to the administrative offices, disappearing through a door marked staff only before Zaire could call out. Graham was faster. He pushed through the front entrance and moved toward the hallway, but by the time he reached the door, the corridor was empty. No footsteps, no closing door in the distance, just the fluorescent hum and the faint smell of floor wax. Zaire stood in the lobby, staring at the spot where the man had been, trying to make sense of how someone could vanish that quickly in a building with limited exits. Graham came back, jaw tight, and photographed the sign-in sheet on the counter. The last entry was time-stamped at 2:47 p.m., name written in neat block letters. Thomas Larkin, purpose, student pickup authorization. The handwriting matched the envelope. He was here, Zaire said. Graham was already scrolling through his phone. Then headlights swept the parking lot, and a car pulled in too fast, tires crunching over gravel. Kala stepped out, and for the first time since the reunion, she looked like someone who hadn't rehearsed what came next. Her hair was pulled back, her coat buttoned wrong, and when she saw Zaire through the glass, her expression shifted, relief, guilt, fear. She pushed through and stopped a few feet away, hands raised like she wasn't a threat. I didn't know they were going to do this, she said, voice cracking. I swear, Zaire, I didn't know they'd go after her. Graham stepped between them, not aggressive, just present. Who's they? He asked, calm but direct. Kala looked at him, then back at Zaire. I don't know their names, she said finally. Someone called me 3 weeks ago. They said Zaire was stealing from a federal contractor, that there was going to be an investigation, and if I helped confirm where he'd be and what he was doing, it would help me in court. Her hands dropped to her sides. They said it would give me leverage for custody. They said he was lying to me about his job, and I believed them because, she stopped herself, but the silence finished the sentence for her. Because she'd wanted to believe it. Zaire felt something cold settle in his chest. Not anger exactly, but the kind of clarity that comes when you realize someone you used to love chose to be complicit. You set me up, he said quietly. Kala shook her head too quickly. I thought I was protecting her. I thought if you were doing something illegal, she needed to be with me. Graham's voice cut through. The envelope. Did you write it? Kala blinked. No. It showed up at my place the same week. Same handwriting as the note they left in my mailbox. Graham pulled a small object from Zaire's jacket pocket. A keychain Zaire had picked up months ago from a vendor table outside the Arlington building. A cheap promotional item with a company logo. Graham turned it over, and on the back, barely visible, was a thin metallic strip no larger than a grain of rice. They've been tracking you, Graham said quietly. Kala's face went pale. I didn't know about that. I swear. But the way she said it, too fast, too defensive, made it clear she'd suspected something was wrong and hadn't asked questions because the answers would have made her complicit. Graham looked at Zaire, and in that look was the confirmation of something Zaire had been trying not to believe. Kala hadn't been the hunter. She'd been the bait holder, and whoever was pulling the strings had known exactly how to use her. Subscribe before someone you trust becomes the person tracking you. Graham didn't wait for Kala to leave. He walked Zaire to the car and drove in silence until they reached a rest stop off I-95 in Prince William County, Virginia, one of those places where truckers sleep in their cabs and vending machines hum under sodium lights. He pulled out a tablet from under the seat and opened a folder that looked like it had been compiled by someone who didn't sleep. "I need you to see something," Graham said, and the screen filled with a network diagram, nodes and lines connecting cities and counties like veins. Cook County in Illinois, Harris County in Texas, Prince William County and Arlington in Virginia, Fairfax County, and smaller jurisdictions in Maryland and D.C. "This is how the fraud moves," Graham said, tracing a route. Procurement contracts get approved in one county, shipments routed through another, payments processed in a third. The paper trail crosses so many jurisdictions that no single investigator sees the whole picture. He zoomed in on a cluster tied to a vendor in Cook County. "This company doesn't exist. The address is a UPS store in Chicago, but they've billed the federal government $12 million over 18 months. He swiped to another node. "Shipments go through Houston and Harris County, Texas, then get rerouted to Prince William County and Arlington. Every step, someone signs off with credentials matching real employees who don't remember approving anything." Zaire stared at the screen, trying to process the scale. "I found one flash drive," he said. "How does that connect to this?" Graham looked at him, and for the first time since the reunion, he looked tired. "You weren't supposed to find it. You were supposed to be invisible. But you noticed the shipments didn't match, you noticed after-hours deliveries, and you reported it. That's when you became a problem." He tapped the screen. "The people running this need someone to blame before the warrants hit. Someone with access. Someone whose badge shows up in the logs. Someone who's already been painted as unstable. A single dad who lost custody and can't keep his life together." Zaire's phone buzzed, and he almost didn't look, but the name made him stop. It was someone he'd worked with years ago, someone who'd gotten out clean. The message was short: "They're using your kid." Zaire showed Graham. Graham's jaw tightened, but he didn't look surprised. "I know. The school pickup wasn't random. They wanted to see how fast we'd react, how much we know." Zaire felt his throat close. "She's with," Graham cut him off. "With her grandmother. I had someone check. But they're not done testing pressure points." Graham closed the tablet and leaned back, staring at the ceiling like he was calculating something he didn't want to say. "There's a leak inside," he said finally. "Someone in the institution knows what we're doing before we do it. That's how they knew you'd be in Knoxville. That's how they knew your daughter's school." Zaire's hands curled into fists. "Who?" Graham shook his head. "If I knew, this would be over. But they have access to internal communications, movement logs, case timelines." He paused. "The hearing isn't weeks away. It's in 3 days. They're moving faster because they know the federal investigation is about to go public, and they need you named before that happens." Zaire stared out the window at the empty lot, at trucks lined up like sleeping animals, at the vending machine glowing cold and blue. "How do I fight something like this?" Graham turned to him, and the answer in his eyes wasn't comforting. "You show up. You tell the truth. And you hope the system works before they finish framing you." Then he said the thing that made Zaire's chest go cold. "They're planning to find evidence staged using your badge access history. Entries showing you in the building when the shipments came through. Your credentials tied to approvals you never made. They've been building the case for months, and the reunion was just the signal flare to confirm you were still reachable." The federal building in Arlington looked the same at 3 in the morning as it did at noon. Fluorescent lights buzzing, linoleum floors squeaking under every step, the metal detector beeping before letting Graham through. Zaire's badge reader blinked red, then green, then red before finally clicking open, and the sound felt like a preview of what the hearing would be. Doors that only opened when someone else decided. The air smelled like industrial carpet cleaner and something metallic and cold. They met with a lawyer Graham had vouched for. A woman named Reese who wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke in sentences that assumed you already knew the rules. She laid out the timeline on a conference table, her tone making it clear she wasn't there to comfort anyone. "They're going to introduce the staged evidence first," Reese said, tapping a printout. "Badge access logs showing you in restricted areas during shipment windows. Approvals with your credentials attached to vendors that don't exist. You look either complicit or incompetent." She looked at Zaire over her glasses. "Your job is to not sound defensive. The moment you sound like you're making excuses, you've lost." Zaire's hands tightened. "I'm not making excuses. I'm telling the truth." Reese nodded like she'd heard that before. "The truth only matters if you can prove it. Do you still have the item you kept?" Zaire's stomach dropped. He'd hidden the flash drive in a Ziploc bag behind the bathroom sink in his Arlington apartment. "I need to check," he said quietly. By the time they left the federal building, the sun was starting to turn the sky purple, and Zaire's phone had 6 missed calls from Kala. He didn't listen to the voicemails. Graham drove them to a diner in Alexandria, Virginia, the kind that stays open all night for people who work shifts that don't fit normal clocks. The booths were empty except for a man in the corner reading an old newspaper, and the waitress poured coffee without asking. Graham spread the documents across the table, and Zaire tried to focus on the timelines, on the discrepancies, on the fact that his badge had been used to approve shipments he'd never seen. But his mind kept going back to the flash drive, to whether it was still there. "What if it's gone?" he asked. Graham didn't look up. "Then we fight without it." Zaire's phone buzzed again. "Kala." He silenced it. The waitress came back, lingered too long near their booth, refilled coffee they hadn't touched, and asked if they needed anything in a way that felt less like service and more like checking. Graham watched her walk away, then glanced toward the parking lot. A sedan had been idling near the edge since they'd arrived, engine running, no one getting out. "Someone's watching," Zaire said. Graham's jaw tightened. "I know." He pulled one of the documents closer and frowned. "This doesn't match." Zaire leaned in. It was a shipping manifest, and the date stamp showed a delivery approved under Zaire's credentials on a Tuesday in September. "I wasn't even in the building that day," Zaire said. "I was at my daughter's school for parent-teacher conferences." Graham stared at the document. They didn't just stage evidence. They got sloppy. For the first time since the reunion, something in his expression looked like hope. "If we can prove you were somewhere else, the whole timeline collapses." Zaire's phone lit up again, and this time it wasn't Kala. It was a text from a number he didn't recognize. "We need to talk. I can testify, but only if you keep my name clean." "See." He showed Graham the screen immediately. Graham read it once, then set the phone down carefully. "She wants to help on her terms," he said. "Question is, do you trust someone who put you here in the first place?" Zaire didn't answer, because the truth was complicated and the hearing was in 2 days. Then Graham's phone buzzed, and when he read the message, his face went hard. "They're moving the evidence presentation up. You're walking in already labeled." The hearing room felt smaller than Zaire expected, wood grain worn smooth on the table from decades of hands gripping too hard, a digital clock flashing red numbers, and the court reporter's steno machine tapping in steady rhythm. Zaire sat next to Reese, Graham behind them, and across the aisle sat 2 men in identical gray suits who looked like they'd never had to explain themselves. The examiner wasn't a judge, but a woman with silver hair who introduced herself as Ms. Talbot. The air conditioning hummed, making the room colder than it needed to be. The staged evidence came first. Badge access logs projected on screen, timestamps in green showing Zaire's credentials entering restricted areas during shipment windows. Approvals bearing his digital signature for vendors that existed only on paper. A paper trail so clean it looked rehearsed. One of the gray suits walked the examiner through each entry, tone flat. September 14th. Restricted access logged at 11:47 p.m. Delivery authorization at 11:52 p.m. Both tied to Mr. Whitcomb's credentials. He didn't look at Zaire when he said it. Zaire felt the weight of perception already set against him, but he didn't collapse into anger. He waited. When Reese nodded, he stood and spoke without shaking. "I wasn't in the building on September 14th. I was at my daughter's school in Prince George's County for parent-teacher conferences. The school has sign-in logs." He handed the examiner printed confirmation. The badge access shown was either cloned or logged remotely. "But it wasn't me." Ms. Talbot read it, then looked at the gray suits. "Do you have rebuttal?" One of them hesitated, and that hesitation shifted the air. Before he could answer, Graham stood. He didn't raise his voice. He simply placed his credentials on the table and spoke with disciplined calm. "This isn't an isolated incident. What you're seeing is part of coordinated procurement fraud spanning Cook County, Harris County, and Northern Virginia. Mr. Whitcomb reported discrepancies and became a target because of it." Then the door opened, and a woman in a business suit stepped in, nodded at Ms. Talbot, and took a seat. Zaire didn't recognize her, but when she was called, her voice was steady. "My name is Nora Kimball. I work in procurement oversight for the Arlington facility. I was instructed to falsify access logs to implicate Mr. Whitcomb. I refused initially, but was told my position would be terminated. I'm here to state the logs were altered. Subscribe so you don't miss how truth fights back. The room went silent except for the steno machine. One of the gray suits stood, started to object, then sat back down. Miss Talbot made a note. Then she called the next witness. Calla Hartwell. Calla walked to the front, and Zaire watched her face. She didn't look at him. She looked at Miss Talbot and said, I was contacted 3 weeks ago by someone who told me my ex-husband was involved in criminal activity. They offered me leverage in custody if I confirmed his location at specific times. I didn't know it was a setup until too late. Her voice cracked. I was used. And I let myself be used because I wanted to believe he was the problem. Ms. Talbot set down her pen. Do you know who contacted you? Calla shook her head. They never gave a name. Then the examiner pulled a sealed envelope from the case file. This was submitted under protective seal by federal investigators this morning. It contains data recovered from a storage device found at the Arlington facility. She looked at Graham. Were you aware of this submission? Graham's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes told Zaire the answer was complicated. The drive Zaire had kept in a Ziploc bag behind his bathroom sink now sat in a federal evidence sleeve, timestamp intact. Miss Talbot opened the envelope, scanned the contents, then closed the folder and looked at both sides. I'm pausing proceedings for a closed discussion. No one leaves this building until I've reviewed this material with independent counsel. The ruling came 3 hours later, not with drama or apology, but with the kind of procedural efficiency that made it feel both anticlimactic and deeply real. Ms. Talbot returned to the hearing room and spoke in the same neutral tone she'd used all morning. Based on the sealed evidence, corroborating testimony from Ms. Kimball, and documented timeline discrepancies presented by Mr. Whitcomb, this panel finds insufficient grounds to proceed with charges. The badge access logs in question were falsified, and Mr. Whitcomb's credentials were used without authorization as part of a broader fraud investigation now under federal jurisdiction. She paused and looked directly at Zaire. Mr. Whitcomb reported irregularities through proper channels and was subsequently targeted. He is cleared of all allegations. Zaire didn't celebrate. He nodded once, stood when Reese told him it was over, and walked out of the hearing room with Graham behind him. The immediate threat was contained, but the leak inside the institution hadn't been solved, and Zaire knew this fight would surface again in different forms, in different rooms. For now, though, his daughter was safe, his name was steady, and his dignity was intact. That was enough. Calla didn't leave the building right away. Zaire saw her in the hallway, standing near the exit, phone pressed to her ear, face tight with the stress that comes when consequences you avoided finally land on you. Her testimony had been recorded, her role in the scheme documented, and while she wouldn't face criminal charges, the custody arrangement she'd fought for was now under review. The system doesn't always deliver justice cleanly, but it does hold people accountable when evidence becomes too clear to ignore. She looked at Zaire once, opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closed it and walked out into the parking garage. There was nothing left to say. By the time Zaire got back to his apartment in Prince George's County, the sun was setting, and his daughter was sitting at the kitchen table doing homework like nothing had happened, because in her world, nothing had. Her grandmother was making dinner, and the smell of rice and chicken filled the small space in a way that made Zaire's chest feel less tight. He sat down across from his daughter, watched her underline something in her notebook with the kind of focus only kids have, and felt the weight of the last week lift just enough to let him breathe normally again. Later, Graham met him in the parking lot of a county park in Prince George's County, the kind of place where people walk dogs and watch the sky turn purple before heading home. They didn't talk much. Graham handed Zaire a folder with copies of the ruling, the cleared record, and a letter confirming his position at the Arlington facility had been restored with back pay. You have choices now, Graham said. You can stay invisible, or you can rebuild openly. Zaire didn't answer right away, because the truth was he didn't know which version of himself he wanted to be anymore. He'd spent so long trying to disappear that the idea of being seen again felt foreign. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, and when he played it later, it was just silence on the other end, like someone had called to check if he'd answer. Graham noticed. They're still out there, he said quietly. Zaire nodded. I know, but for the first time in months, that knowledge didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like information he could work with. When Zaire got home, He found the reunion wristband still stuck to his jacket sleeve, faded and creased from being folded too many times. He stared at it for a second, then dropped it in the trash without ceremony. The system had worked this time, but only because enough people refused to stay silent when it would have been easier to look away. That's the lesson no one wants to hear. Silence is never neutral. It always picks a side.